Okay, who were the movers and shakers? Who was driving this process? How representative of the Australia of the day were the people in the engine room of the Federation movement? Okay, in a cryptic but nevertheless telling remark, Edmund Barton drew an interesting distinction when speaking at Sydney Town Hall on the Federation issue, observing that on any issue there were two aspects. One was the view of the politician and the other was the view of the citizen. They really were a different caste. By 1891, approximately 2/3 of Australians were native born, but no such proportion was represented in the parliaments, and certainly not at the conventions in the 1890s. Of the 42 Australian delegates to the 1891 convention, 17 were born in Australia, not even half. 24 were born in the British Isles and 1 on the Isle of Man. All of the Australian-born delegates were of British descent. And of course, women were conspicuous by their total absence in either the parliaments or at the conventions of 1891 or 1897, 98. Catholics also, who constituted a sizable minority of around 23% of the population, were grossly underrepresented at the final convention, there being only 2 of their number, Glynn of South Australia and O'Connor of New South Wales. And of course the original inhabitants were nowhere to be seen. The Labor Party also was on the rise in the 1890s, but only 1 Labor delegate attended the 1898 convention, Billy Trenworth from Victoria. And that was mainly because David Syme, owner of the Age, the Liberal kingmaker in that colony, included Trenworth's name on a ticket of the Liberal 10. It's worth noting here that while Labor was drawing around 12% of the vote in elections in New South Wales and Victoria, it was up to 36% in Queensland and 25% in Western Australia and South Australia. It was an unheard voice at the conventions, and while Labor was no means united on the issue, a recurring Labor view at the time was that Federation was merely a distraction from the real issues of the day. Occupationally, the decision makers were scarcely a cross-section of contemporary Australia. For example, the New South Wales delegates to the Federal Convention, elected in 1897 to draft an Australian constitution, were typical of the convention as a whole. Of the 10 delegates, 9 were politicians. There goes the pretence of a citizens' movement, now conveniently discarded. 6 of those were lawyers. The 10th delegate was a banker. A foreign visitor to Australia at the time cast a critical eye over the team assembled to create a nation, and he described their handiwork as a lawyer's and a fat man's bill. This was Ben Tillett, a socialist and leader of the British Dockers Union, who was well acquainted with the bitter industrial disputes in Australia in the 1890s. He warned in ominous terms what this bill would mean for workers. Guard well your liberty. Remember the fightings, the imprisonment, the police, the bludgeonings of the past, and beware lest you give those dearly won liberties to those who will be the parasites of the future, robbing you of your political, economical and social rights. Clearly, much organising work had gone into the process of moulding public opinion. There was much talk about the need to foster patriotic sentiment. Parents and teachers were told of their duty to instil into children a pride in Australia and all things Australian. There was also a corresponding fashion for distinctively Australian motifs in popular culture and decor, but it had, as Richard White has pointed out, an underlying commercial purpose. It was associated with the increasing significance of local manufacturing. It was not only about promoting competition, it was about tariff protection. Patriotism, carefully orchestrated, served to protect local manufacturers and their workers from outside competition. Hence we had at the turn of the century a market for patriotic Australians, awash with cooey cheese and tobacco, boomerang brandy and explosives, kangaroo brown bicycles and desiccated potatoes. It also sought to construct a sense of national identity that blurred or even denied class divisions. But while this sentiment was being constructed, work was also taking place on the political machinery, and the goal of a federated nation was increasingly portrayed to the public as not only the logical and natural outcome of the new spirit, but also the most desirable. The late Alan Martin, possibly now best remembered as a very fine biographer of Robert Menzies, almost six decades ago cast a sceptical eye over the southern development in the 1890s of the popular federation movement, and he identified what he called a quite intense propaganda campaign on the part of three separate organisations in Sydney. One of these, the Central Federation League, published, interestingly, the names and occupations of its executive members, whom Martin divided into two groups. Class A, of which there were 53, comprised men of no, and there were, say men because there were no women involved, comprised men of no recognisable interest group. These were mainly professional men with large legal and medical elements. Class B, even more interesting, 73 of these identified strongly with commerce and manufacture, land, building and investment companies, insurance companies, banking and the pastoral industry. So we've got two distinct groups here, but Martin went further and broke down the group B into its constituent elements. Merchants, manufacturers, shipping interests, land, building and investment, insurance and banking. And you've got the totality of the number there. Their coming together and their aims, as Martin suggests, represents a conscious realisation of the economic advantages of federation, and not through some other motive or sets of motives, such as idealism, social progress or defence. One significant event often overlooked on the road to federation was the Great Depression of the 1890s and the subsequent bank crashes of 1893, themselves a product of the speculative boom of the 1880s, mostly in land and fuelled predominantly, overwhelmingly by British investment. By the 1890s, British investment had already shifted its focus to Argentina and South Africa, but the collapse of Barings Bank in 1890, largely over failed investments in Argentina, led to investors taking a much closer interest in possible structural weaknesses in all developing countries. The main Australian colonies, with their considerable budget deficits and heavy public works spending, were cause for concern. And the bank failures in 1893 merely reinforced this concern. Moreover, the radically different approaches to the crisis in Sydney, which were largely successful, and Melbourne, mostly unsuccessful, only added to concerns about investment in the colonies. It was noted that the Australian banking system simply did not have the institutional mechanisms to bail out troubled banks, and the absence of a lender of last resort was commented on by several English bankers at the time. Bankers magazine in 1893 commented, "The Australian banks do not possess, as those in this country do, a great central institution from which sources of supply in the form of legal tender may be obtained. The advantage of a central bank, equipped as the Bank of England is of great service in time of pressure." Indeed, a prominent Sydney banker, Barton Lodge, director of the Sydney Joint Stock Bank, was blunt when he stated in 1899 that the Federation of the Australian colonies would meet and finally settle the difference of opinion that now exists between us and the English capitalist. In Western Australia, powerful London commercial interests were hard at work in the Federation cause. English investors had pressed the West Australian government to amend its mining regulations, notably in regard to labour conditions and lease provisions. It wanted a much more deregulated regime. And it was the prospect of escaping from the forest government in Western Australia that led English investors to wholeheartedly support federation. For this reason, London capitalists sent considerable sums of money to the Coolgardie Chamber of Mines to finance the federal movement, and at least £400 went to the West Australian Federal League in Perth, as well as other sums to branches in the goldfields. And this, I suggest, goes a long way to explain the separatist movement at the time in the eastern goldfields. If the investment could be measured in terms of the yes vote in the West, then it paid off handsomely. This was the referendum result. But if you look at how it breaks down between metropolitan, country and goldfields, goldfields was where the money was spent, where the advertising, where the promotional campaign was spent. And it shows. The goldfields capitalists might not have achieved all they wanted, but the banking interests got their dividend, which should surprise nobody. As Humphrey McQueen puts it, to regain its attractiveness to investors, Australia's financial markets had to become more secure. Bank failures led to a consolidation of domestic financial houses, and Section 105 of the Commonwealth Constitution offered to underwrite public debts. That fiery orator and later Premier of South Australia, Tom Price, was an opponent of federation. He worried that federation was being imposed on a people who had yet to grasp what it meant. And he pointed to the low attendance at campaign meetings and the low vote turnout. He saw federation in league with British imperialism and with an objective essentially for the wealthy. The federal question, he thundered, is nothing but a commercial movement from beginning to end. If we peer behind the rhetoric and the sentiment leading up to federation, it's possible to discern a clear strategy being pursued. And this is evident from Sydney to Perth and even in London. And that is the creation of a single unified market. The market is the cake, the nation merely the icing. A prominent Federation League activist in Sydney and later president of the New South Wales Chamber of Manufacturers, J.P. Wright, was adamant that federation and the interests of manufacturers were one and the same thing. He said, "Commerce will, as far as federated Australia goes, be as free as the air. Manufacturing establishments will be able to circulate their products without obstacles or hindrance." Convenience. This quest for a single market, I suggest, links directly to much of John Howard's rhetoric and actions over the past decade in his state of war against the states and his casual and frequent dismissal of state interests or even state identity. And I want to ask the question here, just whose interests were being represented within the concerted push for federation? If Mr. Barton and his ilk were orchestrating the citizens' dance, to whose tune were they themselves dancing? We might argue with some logic that the states are nothing more than arbitrary lines on a map, which of course they are. But within the confines of those arbitrary lines, they have developed quite distinctive social and political cultures. And these were clearly in evidence at the time of federation. The Liberal Party, for example, in New South Wales, is a very different beast from that in Victoria. Much Sydney liberalism derives from the free trade doctrines of George Reid, whereas Victorian liberalism, at least that of Menzies and Fraser, derived from Deakin and his social liberalism. John Howard could not have emerged from anywhere but Sydney. And a story some years ago drives this home. A former Liberal deputy leader, Neil Brown, recounted how as a young backbencher he visited London at the time when John Gorton's prime ministership was beginning to seriously unravel. At a meeting with Sir Alexander Downer, the father of the current day Alexander Downer, then High Commissioner in London, Downer anxiously inquired about Gorton's troubles. He took Brown aside and lowered his voice. "You must promise me one thing, Mr. Brown," he said, holding Brown's arm very tightly. "Never let the Prime Ministership fall into vulgar Sydney commercial hands." The colourful and very recently exhumed Charles Kingston could not have been anything other than a South Australian, just as Deakin, Reid and Forrest represented in many ways their colonies writ large. In contemporary times, could Don Dunstan have been anything but a South Australian? Could Bjelke Petersen have come from anywhere but Queensland, or Henry Bolte from Victoria? Regionalism is something of which we shall hear more in the years ahead, and it is destined, I think, to play a larger role in our evolving federalism. But again, it's more an administrative device than a new or an alternative identity. At least states have legally recognised lines on the map, but where do regions start and end? Who is in a region and who's out? And I'm reminded of a speech in that Great Bear Pit, the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, at a time when, before Federation, when New South Wales and Victoria were having yet another tiff. And the then Victorian Premier had dared to speak of a common interest between his colony and the people across the Murray in what he called the Riverina. A certain Mr. Cameron was scornful. He said, "We knew no such part of the world. There was no such place as the Riverina. It was a name given by Victorian boss cockies to a place which, when they came over to this colony, they tried to grasp." In more recent times, the last attempt at creating a new state, as the Constitution thoughtfully provides for, failed because of an admittedly skewed definition of what constituted the potential new state. That very canny politician Bob Askin, who had won an election for the Liberal Party in New South Wales in 1965 after 24 years of Labor rule, well knew of the separatist sentiments in the north of the state. And on the campaign trail, he promised, a little unwisely, that he would provide the opportunity to vote at a referendum were he to be elected. Well, he was elected, so he was held to his promise. The referendum was duly held in 1967 and might well have succeeded had not Askin thoughtfully included Newcastle in the region, a gesture promoted as giving the new state a ready-made capital, but in political fact ensuring its continued adherence to Sydney. So if you look at that no vote, which is largely inflated, there's only 30,000 difference, a lot of Newcastle in there. Without Newcastle, that would have been carried. And some of the smaller towns in northern New South Wales, like Inverell, were voting yes up to 78, 80%. But they were out-politicked by the wily Sir Bob Askin. Okay, what might have been? Earlier, I asked you to try to imagine an Australia without the Commonwealth. In a parallel universe somewhere, there might well be 5 or 6 vibrant and diverse nations. New Zealand might also be there. Tasmania and South Australia might have joined forces for economic reasons or attached themselves to one of the other nations. We might, as a peace-loving and essentially cooperative people, have formed an entity more like the European Union, maintaining diversity but pooling our strengths, and like the diverse nations of the West Indies with a separate cricket team. An alternative scenario is the minimal Commonwealth, and that is essentially the one envisaged, but which has never been realised. A nation composed of strong, autonomous states, each with its own source of income and broad sphere of responsibility. Parents don't usually hand over the housekeeping money to the children, yet that is what happened with the creation of the Commonwealth. Tasmania's Edward Braddon, commonly ridiculed, wrongly, as the author of the so-called Braddon Blot in the Constitution, ensuring that for the first decade of most of the Commonwealth revenue returned to the states, was very, very perceptive. The shame is that the Braddon Blot had a sunset clause. Just think about this for a moment. Customs duties formed the major item of revenue in the colonies, while the largest item of expenditure was meeting the interest payments on debt, and they were roughly equivalent. So we had an equilibrium there. But Federation was not going to change in any substantial way the expenditure commitments. So the colonies that became states lost the revenue but retained the debt. Doesn't sound a very attractive proposition. It was, as the late Bradley Selway, former South Australian Solicitor General, wrote, based on an assumption, a foolish assumption, that the Commonwealth need for revenue would be so small that much of it would be returned to the states as surplus. Another assumption was that the Commonwealth would act fairly, honourably and appropriately towards the states. Another distinguished South Australian legal expert, a former Crown Solicitor Albert Hannon, said the decision to agree to this was very, very difficult to understand, much less to excuse. He does, however, offer a simple explanation. The convention delegates were carried away with the enthusiasm and idealism which made them blind to material considerations and probably political tendencies. So the pro-federation campaign was, it seems, far more successful than even its architects wildly imagined. It might have been otherwise. I'm rather attracted to the idea of the Prime Minister and the Treasurer going, say, twice a year to a meeting of the premiers and state treasurers and putting up a case for funding. I wonder then how many futile and costly military expeditions for other people's purposes we would see if they had to be weighed against education, healthcare and public infrastructure. We might even arrive at a more equitable and democratic definition of the national interest. I'm dreaming on there, but on a more practical level, let's turn to the High Court, truly a federal entity in spirit as well as letter. Or so it should be, but is it? It is, in Greg Craven's memorable words, no friend to the states, with the Commonwealth-appointed court basically playing undertaker to Canberra's hitman. Instead of the Commonwealth, or rather the Prime Minister of the day, determining who will fill a vacancy, why not convene a council of the state Chief Justices, perhaps with Attorneys General as advisors, to nominate a candidate? That would really be cooperative federalism at work, but we won't see it. I referred at the start of this lecture to the inherent tensions between the liberal and democratic elements of our system of government and the Constitution. At the time of Federation, Australia was in the forefront of democratic advance. Responsible government, a free and unfettered press, freedom of association, trade unions, free elections, secret ballot, payment of members, a broad franchise, and the property vote was slowly being phased out. We might reasonably have expected a very democratic constitution, but what we got in 1901 was a liberal constitution with a light democratic sprinkling. It was a conservative liberal constitution, and Greg Craven has called it very much a liberal conservative artefact, the greatest work of Australian conservatives. Conspicuously, there is no guarantee of rights. Is it little surprise, therefore, that primary significance in the Constitution is attached to trade and commerce? Overseas and interstate trade was the first head of Commonwealth power in section 51(1, amplified by section 98, which embraced navigation, and amplified again by section 92, guaranteeing free trade. Here again was the single market idea. The problem here, and I agree with Greg Craven about the character of the Constitution, is that the conservative liberal mind is a little uneasy with the notion of democracy. Democracy is acceptable only so long as it does not impinge or interfere with property rights. To restate an earlier theme, it's all about convenience. And the beauty of democracy is that it is deliriously and majestically inconvenient. May it continue to be so. I argue here that Australian financial interests and British capitalists not only contrived to bring about federation for the sake of convenience, their convenience, but that they also embedded in the Constitution provisions that would serve their, not necessarily the people's interests. And remember how Chifley's bank nationalisation scheme of 1948 became constitutionally undone. This is why, for example, there was an early provision for legal appeal to the Privy Council, aimed purely at satisfying British commercial interests. Indeed, the Australian liberal intellectual and sometime politician and diplomat Frederick Eggleston later gave evidence to a Royal Commission on Federation in 1927, where he stated that the Colonial Secretary in London at the time, Joseph Chamberlain, had refused to countenance removal of the right of appeal in private cases because, he said, the big shipping companies and mercantile interests demanded it. That was something that Chamberlain simply would not budge on. Further, Britain never really let go. Federation was not independence, and a reading of the imperial legislation that brought the Commonwealth into existence clearly shows that the Commonwealth of Australia shall be taken as to be a self-governing colony. In other words, 6 colonies were consolidated into 1 colony. Is it really little wonder that the Governor-General was granted those reserve powers? In whose interests were they to be used? Okay, the future of the system, which I did promise to talk about, will depend largely on goodwill, itself fragile and often transitory. But at the moment we're seeing more of it. Optimism is on the rise. The recent water agreement is an encouraging case in point. Increasing cooperation at a regional level by local government is also a good sign, a promising sign. And so too are renewed moves to have local government recognised in the Constitution. Will the states themselves, heavily centralised, devolve functions and, more importantly, resources to the local level? The attacks on the states by Mr Howard and his ministers for purely grubby political reasons attacked the very constitutional fabric of our society. And just as populist premiers of the past have played to the grandstand, they undermined confidence in a system that, while by no means perfect, has served us moderately well, even if it was a mistake. 30 years ago, we began to see a concerted attack on the welfare state and the public sphere in general as the neoliberal revolution gathered momentum. The message was Orwellian in its crass simplicity: public bad, private good. It is simply unproven that private ownership, especially of utilities, is superior in terms of the public benefit than public ownership. It is certainly less accountable, but it is, for some, convenient. The same blowtorch to the belly is currently being applied to the states, and a none too subtle propaganda campaign is dangerously eroding public confidence, and we have to ask to what end and to whose benefit. It remains to me a great pity that these questions were not taken as seriously as they might have been taken in the late 1890s. The Commonwealth and its constitution represented a liberal victory, but of dubious democratic gain. Indeed, it might even be suggested that it was framed to contain democracy. That battle between liberal and democratic forces continues to be a source of tension in our political life, but like the events of more than a century ago, we seldom see the true colours of the key players. There are lessons here to be sure, but whether we learn from them is another thing altogether. Thank you.